All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started. In case you aren't familiar with me, I'm Sam Burden, assistant professor in ECE here at UW. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to host our visit from Professor Chen Li here from the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Chen's a good friend. We overlapped at Berkeley, but he's also just an extraordinary researcher and leader in this area of emerging area of pterodynamics that he really, in his PhD work, helped to define and launch, and then continues to do just really super interesting stuff I'm excited to hear about today. Chen earned his bachelor's and PhD in physics, so bachelor's from Peking University, PhD from Georgia Tech, and then was a postdoc at Berkeley studying integrative biology and robotics. That's where I got to meet him. And then he's been at Hopkins since then for past 5 or 6 years. And as I said, his work is in this emerging field of pterodynamics that he's basically, a key person working to create and define. And he's received a number of awards. I don't even know if I'm going to get them all here. So he got a Burroughs Wellcome Fund Career Award when he started at Hopkins. He got a Beckman Young Investigator Award, Kavli Frontiers of Science Fellow from the National Academy of Sciences. He was an Army Research Office YIP recipient. And he was also, for the postdoc, he was a Miller Fellow, which for folks who are familiar is a super prestigious kind of campus level postdoc fellowship at Berkeley. He got the Best PhD Thesis Award from Georgia Tech. Chen's just doing fantastic. Really excited to hear from him. Really happy to have him here and have him share his work with you. So please, Chen, take it away. Oh, and sorry. Folks, please hold questions until the end. You're welcome to type them into the chat so we kind of build up a queue, but then Chen will answer them after he gives us his talk. So please, Chen, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for hearing my talk. So I'm going to give you an overview of the work we've been doing over the past few years towards understanding animal and robot locomotion in complex 3D terrain. So we have been envisioning having robots go to everywhere and help us humans in many endeavors. What's shown here are just several examples of terrestrial robots that have been created. And we already have a lot of these robots that are performing quite well in complex environment. The most well known these days are the self-driving cars. So you can see here, as this self-driving car illustrates, a dominant approach of robot locomotion in complex environment is to create a geometric representation of the surrounding and then categorize anything that's, in this case, other than the paved road that you can move well on as obstacles and try to avoid them to reach your goal by transitioning across different driving modes. So there are 2 premises here that need to work for this approach to be useful. First, the locomotor environment interaction, in this case, the wheel-ground interaction, must be well understood. And second, the vehicle, the robot, the agent here must be readily controlled to follow the planned trajectory. And this is thanks to many decades of studies of vehicle and tire dynamics for paved roads, as well as terramechanics for vehicle mobility in off-road environments. And analogous to this, we also have built up quite a bit of understanding of how to create devices or vehicles or robots that can fly and move underwater, thanks to a long history of the entire fields of air and hydrodynamics to understand the interaction between devices and the environment by creating tools and models. And we also, thanks to decades of studies in terrestrial locomotion, we also understand quite well how to generate and how to stabilize near steady state single mode locomotion on relatively flat, rigid ground. And it is in fact because we know such interaction, we understand them as well as we do, that we have amazing robots from places like Boston Dynamics. And just a little bit of history, Mark Raber, the founder of Boston Dynamics, in fact was a professor for 15 years, first at Carnegie Mellon, then at MIT, who led the LEG lab, and he, in fact, back in 1986, had written a book which had already captured a lot of the fundamental dynamics of leg-ground interaction really quite well, even when biologists are still trying to understand these in animals. So he's really well ahead of his time. And it is really through the integration of sensing, control, and planning, which are traditionally in the robotics domain, together with such understanding or an appreciation of tune mechanics and dynamics of the interaction, that we have these amazing robots. And we also have other robots, just a couple of examples that also make use of this philosophy. Yeah, so we understand this quite well. However, when it comes to a more complex environment, for example, desert sand or a loose Martian soil that can flow around, or such environment as forest floor or earthquake rubble, where you have a lot of large obstacles cluttered together, we still have a relative lack of tools and models to understand the physical interaction with such complex terrain. And as a result, our robots are still far from robust at traversing these kinds of environments. So in other words, to make progress, we need to begin to create terradynamics analogous to aero and hydrodynamics, which includes tools and models to gain this principled understanding. Yeah, so when I was still a PhD student working with Dan Goldman, really his lab was the first to take experimental physics approach at this kind of problem. And in his lab, we focused on locomotion on granular media like sand. And I specifically focused on legged locomotion as one of his first students. So in my PhD, through studies of animals and robots on controlled sand, much like you have a wind tunnel controlling air, we eventually created resistive force theory, which is essentially mapping out the lift and drag forces in granular media, which turn out to predict locomotion very accurately. And since I moved to Berkeley working with Bob Fo and Ron Fearing, I began thinking about how to expand this terradynamics using this interdisciplinary approach into other kinds of terrain. And I decided to look at these kinds of complex 3D terrain cluttered with large obstacles. And this is not to say that people haven't studied or thought about this. There have been a lot of studies. This is just one example. In fact, 20 years ago, Dan Kodachek's lab had already built this Rex robot, which, as you can see here, is pretty good at overcoming some of these really large obstacles and tumbling down with minimal or almost no sensing here. But still, as compared to our understanding of how to use environmental geometry to plan motion to avoid obstacles, we still don't have a conceptual framework to understand how to compose a series of locomotor transitions which you would require to traverse all these heterogeneous 3D terrain to reach your goal. And as a result, our robots are still not very robust, as you can see in some of these examples. So we still need to gain this principled understanding of how to use and control physical interaction to do what you want. Yeah, animals, by contrast, are amazingly good at going through almost any environment, and you can see they can transition across different locomotor modes to traverse with great ease. So when we look at our knowledge for terrestrial locomotion, as I had already alluded earlier, the majority of the studies have focused on how to generate steady state locomotion and how to stabilize it when you are encountering a single obstacle. Basically, in terms of dynamical systems theory, understanding this has been centered around this concept of limit cycle, how to generate and how to stabilize around it, either through passive mechanics or active sensory feedback control. But obviously, animals and robots can do way beyond that, as you see from some of these earlier studies. So how do we begin to understand this? We still have a relative lack of conceptual ways of thinking about locomotor transitions. Yeah, so this was something that I have been working with since my postdoc. So when I was first started working with Bob and decided to study this, as you can see, this is just formidable. You have so many different things completely unstructured. How do we even begin to make progress? So what I decided to do then is to look at one subset of obstacles that you might encounter, which is dense vegetation. And by looking at grass as a simple starting point, a simple model terrain, I can then create these kind of model grass by laser cutting paper, much like a wind tunnel, to control airs to enable repeatable experiments. With this, what we discovered is that these animals can use many different modes to traverse and transitioning through them. And if you look at a single trial, it seems quite stochastic. But when you have enough samples, you can see that there seem to be probabilistic patterns. For example, this roll mode, in which the animal goes through the gap between beams by rolling its body, turn out to be most frequent and also the fastest. Yeah, so over the last few years, we have been inspired by this initial success and abstracted a variety of distinct locomotor challenges from these kinds of heterogeneous 3D terrain and study them using this principled approach. Yeah, so our hope is that if we can understand how locomotor modes and transitions emerge through physical interaction controlled by the nervous system for these distinct challenges, perhaps we can put them together probabilistically to begin to understand how animals do this and also to enable robots to do this in a more robust way. Yeah, so towards that end, my lab has this interdisciplinary integrative approach at the interface of biology, robotics, and physics. And we also integrate pretty heavily animal and robot experiments together with physics modeling. So yeah, so here are just a kind of a snapshot of the variety of studies that we have done. On top here, these are just examples of the kinds of tools that we created. For example, these beams with controlled and variable stiffness that we can use to study interaction in a repeatable but also systematic manner, varying parameters. Also, we developed ways to measure the 3D motion and the interaction, which turned out to be not trivial. It's pretty hard, especially you'll see later if you want to look in detail how the limbs are moving when you have such a cluttered environment. And also here we have a tool we just created recently to record the animal's locomotion through obstacles over a long period of time and distance. Using these tools, we then studied these distinct locomotor challenges, which we abstracted in both animals and robotic physical models. And finally, based on these observations, we then create physics models, which can range from very simple ones from on the left to more complex, more nuanced ones on the right. So I won't go through all of these. I'll just focus on one particular model system of these beam traversal and one particular type of modeling with using potential energy landscape, which turn out to yield pretty general insights. But before I talk about this, I want to emphasize that we were inspired again by successes in the field of animal locomotion, where, as we all know, animals they have a lot of sensors, and their locomotion is very often modulated by sensory feedback. But it is very often fruitful to first study what happens during feed-forward motion. It's very often using robotic physical models such as these. You can generate motions that are similar to the animal without sensory feedback and understand how forces are being developed. And once you have these basic understanding that's validated against experiments, you can then take the next step to understand sensory feedback control. So that's the same approach or philosophy that we take here. We'll first study animal during escape behavior where they're really bandwidth limited with their sensory feedback process, that their movement is a little bit leaned more towards the feed-forward limit. And also we start with feed-forward robotic physical model. Once we gain a sufficient understanding, we then build on it to study sensory feedback control. Okay, so here's our model system. This is led by my most senior PhD student, Ratan, who actually just defended 2 days ago, and he is actually looking for a postdoc or a research position. So just a little advertisement for him. And so what he has focused on in this project is this transition during beam traversal from what we call pitch to a roll mode. So here is what the pitch mode looks like. It really is the animal just pushing down the beams to traverse, in which case the body has to pitch up a bit because of the restoring torque from the beams. And here's the roll mode, where the animal rolls its body to go through the gap. It very often starts trying to push down the beams with pitch, but quickly transitions to the roll mode. So how do we understand how this transition emerged from the physical interaction and how it can be controlled? So the first simple model that we had thought of is to completely ignore the dynamics of the interaction and only consider the potential energy of the system, which is the sum of gravitational energy of the body and the beams and the elastic energy of these beams with torsion springs. Here we are approximating the body just as a simple rigid body as a first order approximation. Once we have this model, we can then calculate how the total potential energy of the system is going to vary with the position and orientation of this body when it's in the neighborhood of these beams. And here's what it looks like when the body is very close to the beams, right in the middle, as a function of body pitch and body roll. And you can see that there are 3 local minima basins. In the middle here, you have a pitch basin. If you fall to the minima there, the system state is going to look like this. The body is slightly pitched up, deflecting the beams by just a little bit. And then there are these 2 other basins on the left and the right here, which corresponds to the body rolled into the gap without deflecting the beams. Yeah, so you can see that the state of the system here is reminiscent of the animal and the beam state during this pitch and the roll mode here. So what this suggests is that perhaps this transition from the pitch to the roll mode when viewed on the potential energy landscape is a transition to escape from the attraction into this pitch basin to then reach the roll basin, over which you have to overcome potential energy barriers separating these basins. So is this true that these transitions can be understood as destabilizing barrier crossing transitions? Here we assume that the system is going to be attracted towards the basin because of the kind of self-propulsion disturbing it. So then the next very simple hypothesis we had is when you look at how these animals traverse from my earlier study, you can see that their self-propulsion from the legs can actually induce quite a bit of body oscillation. So the simplest strategy you can think of if the animal has no sensory feedback is that you just vibrate your body to generate sufficient kinetic energy. And if that's enough, maybe it's going to probabilistically induce you to overcome these barriers. And this would be useful without sensory feedback. So to test this first hypothesis, what Ratan did is to create this robotic physical model, which is completely feed-forward, no sensory feedback. It's basically a physical realization of our simple model. You drive this body forward with motors here. It's overhung here, free to pitch and roll through a gyroscope mechanism in response to its interaction. And then we can apply various levels of oscillation with different kinetic energy to see how that affects the transitions. Yeah, so here are representative trials on the left. On top, you see that if the body is in the middle without any oscillation, it is stuck in this pitch mode, pushing down the beams when it's forced forward to traverse. Whereas below, when you have a little bit of oscillation, actually sufficient oscillation, you quickly transition to this roll mode. And we did this for many trials, varying the kinetic energy oscillation level. And here, all of these dots, each dot and trajectory is a single trial. And you can see that when we do have enough oscillation, it's able to escape this strong attraction towards the pitch basin to enter the roll basin. Whereas if you don't have that, then you're strongly attracted and stuck in the pitch basin. And we can further quantify the comparison between the barrier and the kinetic energy. So we basically take a cross-section cut from the minima of the pitch basin through the saddle point to find that potential energy barrier to escape, and then compare that to the measured kinetic energy fluctuation. And and as you see here, as you go forward, this landscape is going to evolve as we increase in x position, which is forward. So the barrier is going to come down and then go back up. And we find that it is exactly when the barrier is below the kinetic energy fluctuation here that the system is able to make this transition, which is confirms our hypotheses in this feed-forward robot. In addition, we have also varied the stiffness of these beams, simulating very flimsy grass, flimsy vegetation to very stiff vegetation. And we find that the system displays a preference of which mode it uses depending on the stiffness. And this is all passive. There's no active sensing and feedback. It just emerges from the physical interaction. But what we find is that when you have very flimsy beams with low stiffness, the system is always stuck in that pitch mode. Whereas when it's stiff, it very much more frequently transitions to the rolling mode. And when we look at if you pay attention to these videos, you are going to notice that the basin, the minima basin, the minima of these basin, the potential energy level differs when you change the stiffness. So you can see that when the beams are really stiff, what's shown here, in these curves, solid curves are experiment, and the dashed is a simple model. You can see that the stiff beams is going to lead to the pitch basin going very high compared to the roll basin. And then when it's very flimsy, the pitch basin is actually lower than the roll basin. So what this suggests is that there's this concept of pterodynamic favorability. Depending on your environment, how favorable each mode is going to change, and this passive physical interaction is going to actually be affected by that. So later we also did animal experiments, basically repeating these same measurements and modeling for animals, and we found qualitatively similar observations throughout pretty much everything, that the transition is a destabilizing barrier crossing transition. There's this pterodynamic favorability, which governs how frequent you stay in one mode or transition to another mode. But one distinct difference is that when we look at quantitatively how much the kinetic energy compares with the potential energy barrier, we found that in the animal, even when the potential energy barrier is still quite a bit higher than the kinetic energy. The kinetic energy is comparable to the barrier, but not quite enough. The animal can already begin to make transitions here in this gray band. So what this suggests is that the animal has to be doing something better than the very naive vibration that our dumb robot is doing. And we speculate it's either perhaps steering itself on the landscape, or perhaps even modifying the shape or even the topology of the landscape to reduce or maybe even eliminate barriers. So towards understanding that, my more junior PhD student, Ya-Ching, has done this more recent project where we take a closer look at the various adjustment of the legs as well as the body in this process. And we found that the animals are going to sprawl their legs outward when they are pitching up, but then tuck them inside when they make this transition, which is likely to reduce the roll stability. And then they are also going to extend one leg while withdrawing another, which are likely to generate a torque for rolling. But we don't know for sure because we have not had force measurements yet. But there are also other interesting measurements which we don't quite understand yet. We see that the animal flexes its head up and down quite frequently before it makes the transition. But after it makes the transition, it flexes its abdomen quite rigorously when it tries to maneuver through the gap. And we hypothesize that this head might be doing this to sense the resistance of the terrain, because these insects are known to have proprioception, basically the sensors inside their body to measure the strain when they are generating forces against the environment. And this flexion might be to kind of disengage from interlocking with the obstacle to basically disrupt that frictional contact. So towards better understanding this in a principled way, Yaqing had recently developed a refined robotic physical model where he added force sensors to measure the forces from the environment, as well as more degrees of freedom controlling the bending of the head and the abdomen, as well as control of body position and rotation with sensory feedback. So we're hoping to use this to better understand how to sense and use physical interaction intelligently. And a major hypothesis we have here is that here's an analogy: when you are kind of navigating a real terrain here, for example, to go from the basin on this side to the other side, you can see where there's a saddle point and just choose that path, which is the easiest. But for this potential energy landscape, we can't really see it. But we know that the system behavior is strongly governed by these potential energy landscape, as we have shown, which suggests that the conservative forces which result in the potential energy must play a major role. So if we can measure the forces against the environment, which is going to be largely dominated by these conservative forces, we can perhaps use this to make sense of the topology and the shape of these potential energy landscapes, and then apply more well-established methods such as gradient descent or ascent, etc., to try to navigate intelligently. Yes, and here's just another more recent study to, as an example, to show how we can use physical force sensing, contact force sensing, to make intelligent transitions. This is a much simpler case where we just have a rigid body, but we do have the ability for this body to detect contact forces from the environment. This is led by my other PhD student, Chihan. So what he had demonstrated here is that if there's no sensing, if it's feet forward, the robot, without any energy fluctuation, oscillation, is just going to push forward, whether it's stiff or flimsy, the beams. But when he adds these contact force sensing, he can then actually estimate how stiff these beams are, and then calculate which mode is more favorable and make the desired transition, as you see on top here. So I have elaborated in using this beam traversal line of research, but how we do these, but we have actually, as I mentioned, studied a variety of distinct locomotor challenges, and it turned out they're quite surprising general features. So first, we find that the interaction with the resulting locomotion when animals or robots interact with these different environment, different scenarios, are all very stochastic, but also highly stereotyped, and that leads to stereotyped locomotive mode transitions. And all of these emerge from the system being strongly attracted to these distinct basins on the potential energy landscape. And through this conceptual framework, we can now explain many strategies which we have discovered empirically, as well as some that we had predicted from the model, what kinds of strategy, whether that's changing the morphology in this case, or adjusting the body kinematics in response to the obstacle, or even adding and redirecting energy in different directions. And using these strategies, we're able to increase the performance here, the probability of succeeding in these traversal or self-riding for all these systems. Yeah, but overall, we find that these strategies can be categorized as one of these three categories: steering yourself on the landscape, changing the barrier by changing the landscape shape, or even changing the landscape topology by adding or removing basins. So we kind of speculate, or we posit that there's this potential energy landscape dominated regime in which there are, along the directions where you want to make desired transitions, there are potential energy barriers that are comparable or even higher than the energy work that you can do during each cycle. And you really have to understand this very well to do it. Otherwise, you're going to be wasting your effort, as kind of analogously shown by this video. Yeah. So this. So another way of thinking about this is nicely illustrated by the stereotypical hierarchy of animal behavior, as reviewed by Gordon Berman. So when you have many degrees of freedom, you can, in principle, move in any way arbitrarily to generate motion. But in fact, when you look at real organisms or really well kind of robots or devices that work well, their movement is very often very stereotyped, and also they're even more high-level organization, hierarchical organization of behavior and transitions between behaviors. And what our work suggests is that in this regime, because of this physical interaction plays a dominant role, you really have to understand them very well to do the right, generate the right control within your own degrees of freedom to achieve what you want. Okay, so just a little bit more broader implications. As I mentioned, we don't have very good conceptual framework to understand this. I'm not claiming that we have that yet, but what our work suggests is that because we see this strong attraction towards these landscape basins, this suggests that there are perhaps attractors which can lead to other modes beyond walking and running that we are all familiar with, and you might be pulled towards those basins, or you might want to do something active to try to jump between these basins to make transitions when you are trying to go through this kinds of terrain. Yeah, and why would this be useful? People have used attractive basins funneled into each other to compose high-level locomotor tasks, as you see here from some well-known examples pioneered by Dan Kotacek's group. And our hope is that this is different. We don't have these basins that funnel into each other. We really have to hop out of a basin to find another basin. But our hope is that we can perhaps one day, by understanding these physical interaction coupled with understanding and methods to apply intelligence to help compose locomotive transitions, hopping across basins to generate high-level locomotive tasks. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm gonna also give a quick overview of another relatively small direction. This is maybe 20–30% of our lab's work over the last few years, looking at snake locomotion, limbless locomotion. Yeah, so we haven't gained as deeper or broader insight yet, but there are already some very exciting new knowledge that we have gained that we're still working on. So yeah, so just a little bit of background. So people have studied snake locomotion for quite a while, kind of starting from early last century. And the most widely studied behavior of snakes is using these lateral undulation to move over relatively flat surfaces where you have push points. And what is found in these cases, in these examples, is that snakes can, for these generalist snakes, which are not specialized in a particular terrain, they can adjust their body to adapt to the environment. Here, these little pegs that are a little hard to see. These are the larger pegs, yeah, but they can make these adjustments to direct the forces to the direction they want to generate locomotion without slipping very much. And analogous to this, roboticists have applied similar approaches here with lateral undulation and pushing, also with undulation and controlled compliance to not become stuck. And you can see we can generate pretty good snake locomotion with high performance approaching that of the animals. We also know snakes can go through 3D terrain, as you see here, really well. Again, they don't seem to slip very much at all, and sometimes even move very dynamically. But our snake robots are not doing quite well here, nearly as well compared to the animal, as compared to the case of flat surfaces. And you can see that the robots are still slipping quite a bit. Yeah, so when we first thought about this problem, we again decided to start with something very simple, And we picked this very large step-like obstacle as a simple model terrain. And it can be found in the wild in these animals' natural habitat. And there's a particular challenge here. You can see that the snakes obviously will have to deform its body well out this plane into a 3D shape. And this presents a stability challenge. When you have very little out-of-plane movement, the snake locomotion is inherently stable. But when you have 3D deformation, as illustrated very nicely by Ross Hatton's work with how he chose it, you can see that stability becomes a challenge. And Rio snakes solve this problem by making use of anchor points in the environment, such as these twigs in arboreal environment, or even creating their own anchor points by creating a trough in sand to brace themselves against it. And through learning from these, we can also create robots that do this pretty well. But for such a large step-like rigid, smooth obstacle, you cannot really create your own anchor points, which are absent. So robots have relied on artificial gates, such as this geometric planning or path planning or follow the leader gate. And you can see that they're in general quite slow because of the stability challenge. So when we first started, we challenged this generalist king snake to traverse large steps. Here, this one is about 20% of the body length. And we developed a method to interpolate between these markers to quantify the midline, the orientation of the body, as well as the kind of outline surface of the body. It still has some error, but it's better than the more widely used B-spline geometric interpolation, because we have a very simple elastic model of the body, which is far from the real biomechanics, but it's better than a pure geometric model. From this, we can then extract the pattern. And what we found is that here is a 30% body length step height. You can see that the animal transitions between this lateral undulation for propulsion and cantilevering in the vertical plane to bridge this height difference. And so here's the abstracted gauge transition template. And we found that this is actually well conserved when we challenge the animal to go from low to high friction, low to high step, and from high to low friction. Even when it's very challenging here, you can see it still maintains this transitional gait. And what's really remarkable is when we calculated the stability, basically where the center of mass falls, it always falls within the support polygon created by the body in contact with the horizontal surface. It's 100% stable. So next we want to further understand the stability principles. So we created this robotic physical model, which is done by my PhD student Qiyuan. So you can see that here, simply by using this gait that we learned from the animal, the robot can traverse a pretty large step height relatively fast at very high probability, 90%. And in fact, we haven't tried to optimize the performance. That's not the goal of our lab. But even without doing that, when we measure the step height and the traversal time plotted here against these previous snake robots, we can then draw a line starting from the origin, connecting to any of these data to measure the slope, which is going to be the normalized traversal speed, normalized to body length. And you can see that our robot already has a speed that is higher than all but one of the previous snake robot, even without trying to optimize. In fact, the motors were running at half the speed, at the maximum speed in our experiments. But they're still quite a bit far from the real snakes. So what we think helped is that these artificial gates very often rely on this follow the leader gate, which requires the center mass to be well controlled to fall within this narrow base of support to not fall over. When you have a little bit of perturbation, you are going to tumble over. But when you have this wider base of support, you are going to be much more stable, which we see in the real snakes. However, this is not to say that our robots are not fail-proof. In fact, it fails quite miserably when you challenge it to further traverse this 40% body length step height, and you can see only about 50% of times it succeeds, and it very often struggles, loses stability in the roll direction, and eventually falls over. And this is just one example of failure mode. We again see many different modes which can occur really highly stochastically, induced by noises in the environment as well as the controller. So we actually quantify these transition between different failure modes. And what's notable here is that as the step height becomes higher, this roll instability and eventual flip over becomes more and more frequent. So what's helping the snake being so much better? Obviously, their body is much more continuous with 200 vertebrae compared to the robot's 20 segments. And also they obviously are almost certainly using sensory feedback. As you can see, they're adjusting in more detail how they're moving. But one of the first simple things that we can test is perhaps their body compliance, mechanical compliance might help them better stay engaged and ensure a reliable base of support. So to test that, we added the transmission Wing Qiyuan, and you can see that without adding any sensory feedback, the robot can now traverse at higher probability, 90%, much better at recovering from these roll instability. Yeah, so here's what you saw earlier with rigid robot, and here's the more compliant robot. You can see that it greatly suppresses this failure mode. And finally, more recently, we have been thinking about how to understand locomotion in really more realistic 3D terrains such as these. As you can see from this preliminary video, the snake is doing really well, whereas this is one of the best snake robots that we have from Howie Chosa's group at Carnegie Mellon. And they're both sped up to 10 times, and you can see the robot is struggling still quite a bit compared to the snake, slipping a whole lot. So we were really puzzled how the animals can the animals do this? And here comes a great aha moment from our collaborator Henry Astley. I'm very grateful that he taught us all about snakes and how to study them. But in parallel, his lab has been looking at how snakes use vertical body bending to traverse artificial environments such as these horizontal steps. And they have force sensors to measure the force on one of these pegs. And you can see that the snake can actually generate significant forward propulsion through this body bending. They are confined, that they have very little lateral body bending. And this here is another video where the snake is actually sandwiched within a very narrow tunnel, so that it's not able to do lateral undulation. So you can see that initially it's doing concertina, basically bracing parts of the body against the sidewall and then propelling the other parts forward. But as soon as it reaches this wedge, you can see that it stops doing concertina and simply slides forward using this propagation of the vertical bending. So both of these suggest that the vertical bending might be very useful for generating propulsion, which no previous studies, either in animal or robot, have considered seriously. So we have discussed that we have actually submitted a proposal to understand this systematically, but our big hypothesis is that if the animals and robot can use vertical and lateral bending together, it's going to drastically increase the possible propulsive surfaces in complex 3D terrain. And this can perhaps explain and also help explain the animals' performance and versatility, and help robots to approach that. Yeah, so just as kind of a first proof of concept, my student Qiyuan again had studied these snakes on these kind of uneven surfaces, and he now added all these markers to quantify the movement and the interaction. But first you can see that the snakes pretty much is moving in a virtual tube. It does not slip laterally much at all, maintaining very high performance in this respect. Whereas and then Qiyuan then did this highly accurate reconstruction. Here's the top view. Sorry, here's an oblique view. Here's more of a top view. What he did is he can then classify which little segment of the body is pushing on these edges in a vertical plane. This is a plane that's unwrapped from this kind of curved plane, vertical plane here. And also he can look from the top view to see which segment is pushing on sideways on the blocks that are higher than the body, which are shown in yellow. So through these quantification, what we can then do is to count how many push points you have in both vertical and lateral bending. For example, here, this is the top view. This segment is pushing against this, appears to be pushed against this block that's higher. So it's likely generating a force this way, which has a component to the forward direction of the snake. And then there are these 3 points that the body is contacting these horizontal edges in the vertical plane that is perhaps pushing it forward. And there are these ones that are pushing it backward, but we don't count that. So we're only counting the possibly forward propelling contacts for lateral bending and vertical bending. And we found that they are actually quite comparable, roughly 50% each. So this means that, or this supports our hypothesis that the snakes might be very well using these, but we don't know for sure. That's what hopefully our proposal is going to allow us to create a force sensing terrain array to measure these. And finally, we're also developing as I have alluded, this is almost certainly a sensory, heavily sensory modulated process. So to better understand that, we just developed another snake robot with these custom sensors distributed on the bottom and both sides of each segment. And we actually have been able to control the robot to propel against obstacles to move forward and measure the forces. So we're hoping to use this again as a physical model to understand the sensory feedback principles. So with that, I would like to just end with the grand vision, kind of the ultimate dream that we have is that analogous to the Google street maps or analogous maps that model the geometry and motion planning, if we can add these physics model of the environment, these terradynamic maps, if you will, into the cloud to be shared across robots, it's going to allow many robots to help us do things that we are not able to do yet. So I would like to acknowledge all my lab members, especially my PhD students who I have highlighted, and also a few previous members who have contributed substantially to this work, and many colleagues for their helpful discussion and all our funding sources which enable us to do these fundamental research. And thank you all for your attention, and I'll take questions.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Chen, for that tour de force of just super provocative, super interesting results. What questions do folks have? Yeah, please feel free.
Hey, yeah. So thanks for the talk. Like, actually, I mean, I work on the locomotion in UW here on much larger scale robots. So like what you presented on like insects is definitely very intriguing to me. So guys, as a general question on my side, I would like to start with asking why would you like choose insects as a study for locomotion, and how do you think those results will extend to like much larger scale robots similar to like Boston Dynamics, Spot Mini, all those kind of like larger scale quadrupeds or like biped robots?
That's a very good question. So I think it's certainly, I'm not saying that what we have discovered here, which are kind of studying insects and their physical models, are going to translate across to all robots. It is indeed that when you consider a very large robot, such as the big dog, some of these obstacles that these animals are facing are going to be very trivial. And if you look at, there's a lot of recent progress, for example, leveraging, I actually have a slide to show here, leveraging these very kind of popular, I guess, deep learning approaches to learn to locomote. This is kind of, I see as a orthogonal approach to ours, which doesn't care about any of the, I guess I shouldn't say any, but really kind of brute force using computation, I would say for the most part, to try to solve these problems. And they do fairly well when you have these modest like perturbations from the environment. But what you do see here is that across all of these studies, the robots are maintaining an upright posture they are certainly not quasi-static like the Honda Asimo like many years ago that falls over immediately thanks to their kind of spread posture, but also a little bit of dynamic motion. But I would say they are still very far from what Boston Dynamics can do. And as I try to allude, is I think it's we really want to kind of marry these approaches, not rely on one extreme or the other. I guess what I help you to take away is not specifically the physics model that we have here is going to apply to perhaps your robot, but I think we need to understand these physical interaction better than we do to make further progress. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, like I think like I mean it's a great idea to draw like inspiration from animals, and I personally do some of that in my research. Yeah, but like I guess on the other hand, like animals and robots are inherently different in terms of like the way the actuation works, the sensing works.
Sure.
Like for example, one of the most quadruped robots don't have a spine, but that's been studied many times in biology that spine is an important component for animal locomotion. So like, what do you think is like the limit here? Like, what can we learn from animals, and what are some things we probably shouldn't learn from animals here?
Yeah. That's another great question. So yeah, you asked why do we choose cockroaches or these insects? I always say kind of practically like I went to work with Bob Fold. These are the kind of model organisms that they've been working with for many years, although mostly on relatively simple ground. And I, as a person, have some experience in studying these complex terrain. This was the natural just outcome, I would say. But to get at your bigger question here, I think I think you are completely right that we don't want to like try to copy animals. In fact, I think if you talk with, I think my postdoc advisor Bob Fu would be one of the best person to talk to about this. But there have been a lot of people trying to do what's called bio-inspired robots, but it really is just mimicking animal, especially in, I would say, the earlier stages. I think now people are shifting more towards better understanding the principles and translate the principles. Obviously, they have very different constraints. Animals have different materials than robots and different sensors and controllers, as you already pointed out. And also they have what's called the evolutionary baggage, that they evolve like very slowly, so they cannot really change very much from what their immediate kind of predecessors look like. Whereas in robots, if we understand the principles, we can start over. We can completely throw away the current design and do something. But that's exactly what my lab is trying to do. As you try to point out, I mean, I guess at least the first part, the multi-legged, where we're really focusing on understanding this physical interaction rather than just more of a copying in the animal too. Yeah, that's what I see really as the core of bio-inspiration here. Yeah.
Awesome. There's a question in the chat from Jason. Jason, if you want to unmute and ask, you're welcome to. And if you can't or don't want to, then I will ask. So I'll give you a couple seconds to unmute and ask, and otherwise I'll ask it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you for the talk. This was really interesting. I had two questions that are not super related, but my first question was, how does your group determine, let's say, simple modes for behaviors? Alluding to the example you gave, or in the example diagram you showed in self-driving, where you had like an FSM of different types of states for driving, and yeah. Well, what sort of features or cues do you look for when classifying different behaviors to analyze, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't thought about this very carefully, and there are actually people developing methods to do this more rigorously. So what happened is, like here, I can show here this video will give you an idea. You can see here the animals just come in, hit, forced to stop, and then rows to go through. So I just visually examining it, and they seem to do this quite. Again, it's very stochastic. There's no two trials that look exactly the same, but there's still this stereotypy that I just kind of, I just as an experimenter make a call. And then here you can see that they first try to kind of push through the first couple of layers without much rolling, and then climb the third, and then falls. So those are, yeah, it's really like through all these manual classification that I did this. But we have more recently because now we have better 3D kinematics, which we have enabled by adding all these markers. We can actually look at how the system state or the system trajectory evolves in their state space. So we have thought a little bit more carefully, especially when you're using this energy landscape framework. We want to make sure that what we see as a distinct mode is not cherry picking to show that it's stuck in that mode. So for example, I can give you one little example here. You might have wondered about this, but here you see that all these pitch mode, it looks like it actually fell out of the basin briefly, but that's actually an artifact from the reconstruction of the basin when the system is pushing here. When we construct this landscape, we are always assuming that the beams are being pushed down until it had traversed. But not shown here, but in some of the trials, the body can actually move forward, and geometrically, when you do this computation, the beams are still downward, but they can actually, in the real case, just through little perturbations in the system, they can actually escape prematurely, which results in these artifacts. But we are in this case using our kinematic data to classify these different modes and then look at where they fall. Yeah. So, but as I mentioned, one very good. I don't know very much about how people do this in the robotics field, but in the animal locomotion or animal behavior field, there has been a lot of recent effort. I showed a couple of figures from Gordon Berman's work. Yeah, so this is actually this is a little fruit fly. So what they did is they use computer vision to extract the pose, and then through a series of transformation to collapse the dimension of this. I think very similar to some of the operations in computer vision deep learning, to then abstract it into this kind of low dimensional space. And you can actually see these really high probability cluster of what happens. And that's how they are able to classify, oh, this is the animal being idle, this is the animal slowly doing something, this is the animal locomotion, this, yeah, etc. So there are more formal methods being developed. Yeah.
All right, thanks for your detailed answer. My second question was, and this is kind of related to what was discussed earlier, why study passive animal dynamics if you can get away with high gain feedback linearization?
What do you mean by linearization here?
Or feedback linearization, let's say inverting the system dynamics if you can, if your system allows for it.
Okay, I would say, I would say just on a very high level, the reason that people very often, especially that's why I gave these examples of the other domains. You can see these here. Yeah, you can see these are actually pretty complex interaction. You have the flapping wing kind of interaction with the fluid, and then you also have these oscillation of the body and with flow that can be turbulent. So I would say the primary reason for this is, and I think this is really now well accepted in the animal locomotion field, is that we can certainly start with some very complex behavior involving many different processes, and we can come up with models. We have intuition of how the animal might be doing kind of physical interaction and control. We can create models of high complexity to try to fit that against experimental data to identify the model. That's certainly possible, but the risk there is that when you take that route, instead of starting from something simple that you can more easily make sense even without such high degree of freedom model, is that you might basically have overfit. You might, for example, my postdoc advisor Bob Full, he had actually had a student very early on back in the late 1990s who tried to develop a multi-body dynamic simulation of a cockroach with many segments and even like muscles and and all these joint with various kind of stiffness and damping properties, basically a high fidelity, presumably high fidelity cockroach model, and he can simulate the locomotion, which looks identical to the measured kinematics. But later, when he measured the forces that after he developed a tool to measure such tiny forces, he found that the measured forces from the real animal is completely different from what this model gives, even though the output kinematics is almost similar, is almost identical. And this is just one example. So this is why in the animal locomotion field, we have actually this is kind of popularized by this, I think this philosophy by a nice paper called Templates and Anchors by Bob Foey and Dan Kotychek. But it is very often more fruitful and with a higher chance of leading you to something that actually describes the real physical or dynamic process, to start with something simple and then kind of build on that to add more degrees of freedom to make it more nuanced. So I think that's the kind of philosophy that we're taking here as well.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, super. We're over our hour slot, so out of respect for Chen Li's time and all of our schedules, I think I'm gonna propose that we close the formal session. But thank you again, Chen, for taking the time to share this work with us, meeting with folks. And thanks everybody for attending today.
Thanks everyone.